great venue to begin to share my ideas and to meet others who are working in similar areas. So I'm so glad that you do this. I think this is such a wonderful way for you all to come to know each other's work and learn how to do this crazy thing we do, which is get up and talk to one another about our ideas. So thank you. Thank you for this very warm invitation. It's really an honor to be here and to share these histories with you that I've spent many, many years collecting and thinking about. I titled this Writing History for a World in Crisis, The Radical Possibilities of a Transnational Lens, because I wanted to invite you to think about that, and it really builds well, I think, off of the conversation we just had about social justice. You know, why a transnational lens? What's the purpose of this lens? What does it facilitate? What does it make possible? How does it help us to understand power in more complicated and complex and nuanced ways? And how does it enable us to make visible also strategies of resistance and survival that can really inspire us in this particular moment? So I begin with this image, and I really want to hear from all of you. I tried to whittle this down as much as I could so that it's not too long, because I wanted to create some space for conversation. This is really a question I have more than an assertion. I mean, I do believe from my work that the transnational lens does have radical possibilities, but I'm really curious to hear from you all, now that you're all employing it and working with it, what you have found in your work about it. So I begin with this woman, Italian immigrant woman at Ellis Island, because she really is the person who inspires everything that I do. When I began this project, I wanted to understand the world from her perspective. This is just a photo that was taken by Hine at Ellis Island. And so I asked, what would it mean to tell history from her experience, to follow her as she moves through space and across borders? Just to give you a quick summary of Italian immigrants, just to acquaint you with this history. Between 1870 and 1970, over 26 million migrants left Italy for a period of time. So Italy was this nation sending people out into the world in great numbers. Folks headed to Argentina and Brazil and the US, right? So the US, people were heading to South America in just as many numbers as they were to North America. Nearly 4 million Italians came to the US. They were the largest group to immigrate to the US at the turn of the century, the largest group overall out of all immigrants who came to the US in that period from 1870 to 1920. They experienced very high rates of return. So between 60 and 80% of Italians who came to the US would return to Italy. Okay? So this is a community for whom we can't not study without a transnational lens, right? Italian migration was so characterized by a kind of continual movement in search of labor for both women and men. There were also circuits that migrants traveled in from their home villages. So we see circuits from like Brazil, from southern Italy to Brazil, to Louisiana, to Chicago, or from southern Italy to Argentina, to New York, or from southern Italy to Argentina to Tampa to New York, right? So there are these interesting circuits that also took place. And the majority of immigrants were from the south, were from southern Italy. They were largely peasants or artisans. These were folks who were over 90% were manual laborers. The women of this migration constituted a much smaller group. They were only about a third of the migrants. It was a primarily male migration at first, and then women joined as men became more settled and had more roots, right? Developed enough stability in these lands that they could bring women and their families. But women also migrated to places, of course, like men, where they could find jobs. So the point here is that the Italian migration is very much a transnational one. Women are very much a part of a transnational family economy, even before they migrate, right? In southern Italy, you have villages that were composed primarily of women at the end of the 19th century because the men were leaving for long periods of time. You know, these migrations were for a year to 2 years, sometimes up to 7 years before they would come back and then return again and follow a different circuit, right, in search of work. Men primarily worked in building the infrastructure of the United States and when they came to North America. So they were in the mines, they were building bridges, they were building tunnels, they were doing all different kinds of construction work. And then in cities, they were also artisans, they were barbers and bootmakers and the such. And women primarily went to places where they could find work in garment manufacture and textile manufacture. Those were the places that the industries that they had trained themselves in before they migrated. And so they went to places where, like New York City or Chicago or Philadelphia, where they could find jobs, and particularly in those areas. So when we think about this community, it's important to keep in mind that families, lives, identities, communities, social movements, all reflected these patterns of labor migration at least until the 1940s, and certainly to present day in many cases. But I would say it was a defining feature of life for Italians up until the Second World War. So that just kind of acquaints you with the Italian experience. The reason why I was thinking about the transnational lens now is to think about why we write history, right? Why write about, I'm always asking myself this, who cares about Italians besides me and my family and my friends? And so part of what I hope my work does is think about power and think about resistance and in ways that are meaningful to other people. And I think too that we live in a world, as so many of you were reflecting on the panel before, a world that's in deep crisis, right? Our world is unraveling in so many ways. And so I ask in my work, and I know you're all asking this question too, is how do we write history for the world that we inhabit today that's in crisis, and for worlds that we're writing about that were in crisis, right? That's one thing as historians we know is that the crisis of this particular moment is not the worst crisis that human beings have ever lived through. But we do know that that history can be a teacher, right? That can help us to guide us and help us to understand. Right now we live in a world that was very much like the world of the turn of the last century, in which people who control almost nothing are blamed for everything, and the people who control everything are blamed for nothing. Many of us turn to history for guidance, to help us to understand how power operates, to unmask it and make it visible, but we also want to know how people survived. How they survived enormous suffering and despair, how they overcame it, and hopefully beyond that, right? The vision, the seeds they planted that can inspire us today. And history teaches us, I think, that some of the most inclusive and visionary ideas of human liberation have historically been formulated by those who have been excluded from formal political power, the stigmatized, the semi-literate, the so-called backward and illegal. So I think we need these stories, especially now, to really think through how did these folks plant seeds that maybe came to some fruition then, but that knowingly, planted them knowing that we might need them 100 years from now, 200 years from now. And the Italian anarchists, who I'm going to talk about in a moment, did so in that way. They spoke very consciously about how the worlds that they were creating might not fully manifest, but that they trusted that the seeds they planted would be meaningful for multiple generations. They were thinking many generations ahead, not just of their own lived experience, but for the people who would come after them. So I want to look at two areas today that I think are only visible with a transnational lens. The first is the world of Italian anarchism. This was a group, the anarchists, I think, are so misunderstood. Even today, most people's understanding of anarchism seems to derive from, if not from popular culture, and from an understanding of anarchists as either fanatical or as deranged or as bomb throwers, or it comes out of the 1960s and 70s. Anarchists, the kind of reiteration of anarchism that emerged out of the 60s and 70s. What was less known to me, and I see and hear when people talk about anarchism is less known popularly, is the very transnational anarchist movement of the turn of the century. And it's an incredibly inspiring movement, I think, for us to draw inspiration from, and it was a deeply international, interracial movement that I believe can really help us right now in the moment in which we live. The other thing I would like to discuss with you is also racialization and race and racism, and how this only becomes visible, especially for Europeans, for all groups, but for Europeans, a group that for whom race is often not analyzed and marked, right? That the transnational lens really enabled me to think about how whiteness, how Italians experienced whiteness, how it was constructed for them, their journey with becoming white or in becoming conscious of whiteness themselves, that race was produced in a global context, and that their experience of race happened in a both in Italy and then all the different locations they moved to, right? You can imagine a Southern Italian going from Sicily to Brazil to Louisiana to Chicago is having a very particular experience of race in each of these locations that's shaping their identity, shaping their sense of the world. So I began to appreciate how the need for the transnational lens in order to understand race making in this particular period of time. And then, of course, I think, given how much power is constituted through story and how much nationalist narratives are so invested in the forgetting, right? In a certain forgetting of certain histories, especially the forgetting of histories that undermine its hegemony, that the retrieval of counter-narratives is really especially important right now. Chedi Moraga, one of the original editors of this bridge called My Back, which has just been reissued and is now back in print by SUNY Press, thank goodness. One of the things she says in the foreword to the last edition, she says, the nation state is constructed on forgetfulness and the trauma of invasion, while further acts of invasion are daily perpetuated to throw more displaced bodies between remembering and ourselves. And these are words that have guided me to think about why are some histories, right, forgotten and lost, right? Certainly the history of Italian-American radicalism is a lost history, as well as the racialization of Italians and other European Americans. Similarly, Jackie Alexander writes how the act of recuperating repressed, submerged histories is deeply significant because they provide an antidote to alienation, separation, and the amnesia that domination produces. They offer a way of excavating the costs of collective forgetting so deep that we have forgotten that we have forgotten. So these feminist theorists have really guided my work to think about absence and presence, to think about what is present when we look at history and what are the absences and how can we be, and why those absences are intended in many ways. Susan Laurie Parks, the playwright, calls them fabricated absences, right? She writes, it's the story that you're told that goes, once upon a time you weren't here, and you didn't do shit. So I want to introduce you to some working class immigrant women whose absences have been fabricated because they envisioned and embodied a consciousness that was deeply threatening to those in power on multiple levels. And I'll start with just a few images here that are probably the most famous of the women that I'm introducing you to. Louis Hine and Jacob Riis, of course, two photojournalists, spent a great deal of time documenting immigration at the turn of the century, and their photos became iconic for this period. They really stand in for so much. I mean, every time I want to publish anything, people want to put one of their photos on my work. It's really the way in which I think this country kind of narrates European immigration is through some of these iconic images and texts. So I thought I would just start by just introducing you to the ways these women most commonly circulate in our culture. So this, of course, is Louis Hine. Here's the nameless, faceless, right? We don't have a sense of what her name is. She's the garment worker. We're either coming to her from the shop with a bundle of garments that she's going to finish at her home. And of course, this mixture of old world and new with her carrying the materials on her head in this urban industrial landscape. I'm just going to move through some of these quickly. Sorry, this is a little delayed. This too, Louis Hine, capturing Italian women in a tenement house in the Italian neighborhood, shelling nuts. This too would have produced a certain level of anxiety for middle-class audiences who saw such an image, to think that food, the unsanitary conditions in which food was being manufactured. One of the things I love about this image, though, is, and I think that we can read some of these images against the grain, is to think about the conversation that might have happened, right, in this moment. And then also to think about the use of physical space and the way women transformed these spaces into places of their own creative expression. You know, I love the lace along the top of the door. And if you can see on the upper left hand, I don't know if you can notice, there's little embroidered kind of handkerchiefs in the upper left. You know, these are women who had learned lace making and embroidery as skills for the industrial marketplace. And so to me, it illustrates just the ways that those skills were learned not just to garner wages and not just to enter into a factory and be able to take care of your family, but that they were also to produce beauty and to express creativity and to express their own humanity, right, in their own homes and of course with one another. This next one, sorry, it's a little delay. This is a feather, women working in feather manufacturing, plumes, right, preparing these long plumes that were being used on a variety of different women's fashions at the time. Another characteristic image of this day showing girls, right, how many of the folks working in this kind of labor at this period were young, were teenagers. We're about to come up on the commemoration of the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire, which is at the end of this month, and 146 young women, mostly teenagers, perished in this fire in 1911 in Manhattan in a garment factory because the doors were all locked so the women couldn't take breaks. But this is all part of, to some degree, I think, the national narrative about European immigrants. And then, you know, here's a picture of women who worked in a factory very much like the Triangle Shirtwaist factory fire. Young women who were seamstresses and who, you know, would move from doing homework, taking in garments and finishing them to sewing in factories to produce garments. And then women in the textile mills all throughout the Northeast. But in my book, and I look at northeastern New Jersey, as the industries were changing, becoming more, especially textile work was becoming much more regulated and automated in this period and under supervision, and the machines were becoming larger. And so one of the things that people talk about, the oral histories really know quite often, is just the loudness in the factory, of how loud these looms were. Deafening, they call them, and dangerous, you know, if you got a piece of clothing caught. So these are all part of the national narrative, and of course this image, this kind of almost pathetic, right, woman, that this is Jacob Riis's photo, you know, the Italian immigrant as pitiable, but also deserving of sympathy on some level. And this was what really became fascinating to me, was the ways in which Southern and Eastern European immigrants were seen as racially inferior, were imagined as inferior to Anglos and to Germanics and other Northern and Western Europeans, but were simultaneously situated as white at the same time. And so what I do in my book is look at how both of those narratives were actually working together. They weren't really inconsistent with one another. It was positioning them as inferior whites, but whites nevertheless. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. So I work with these dominant narratives to think through what they make visible and what they make invisible. And as I said, none of these images do we ever come to know these women, know their stories, know their hopes, their dreams, know their struggles, know their social movements, know their political cultures. And so in order to recover this history, I had to begin in Italy, as you can imagine. And in Italy, at the turn of the century, there was a as the mass migration was occurring, Italy witnessed the expansion and proliferation of a revolutionary working class movement in which Italians were increasingly drawn to radical political movements such as anarchism and socialism by the impoverished and exploitive conditions that they encountered at home as well as abroad. The 1890s were an especially volatile period in southern Italy, just as mass migration is beginning. A wave of popular unrest began in Sicily in 1892 and spread quickly throughout the country. In town after town, peasants mobilized, labor strikes occupied fields and piazzas and looted government offices. While Italy had a long history of working class revolt, this moment really marked a new era of social protest, because for the first time, women were leading the social movement. And it was in large part because men had migrated and women were were left behind and were responsible for paying the taxes, which were growing exorbitantly, and they couldn't meet them and also feed their families. So they began to protest. They began to fill their piazzas, fill municipal halls, and really protest the presence of the state. You know, the Italian state was formed in 1861, so late by European standards. And what it meant in southern Italy was just an oppressive regime that extracted more resources rather than gave back to the community. So here you have the Brigantes. This is this generation of rebellious women. Is mid-century, as the nation is in formation. It is about the imposition, right, of a government that, as I said, is extractive. And so you have this social movement that emerges that people call brigantaggio, or banditry. But it was informed by socialism and anarchism, by the very early kinds of seeds of those ideologies. And folks who was more engaged in guerrilla warfare, essentially, trying to keep the state from coming into their lives as much as possible. So you see that in Italy, this is a very well-known movement, a very well-known history, but it's very invisible within American narratives of Italians. Italians are coming from impoverished places, but not places that are radicalized, that are engaged in political struggle. And then in one village, Piano dei Greci, outside of Palermo, this is a photograph that was taken of the women who were active in one of the social movements there. What's interesting about this community is that it was an Albanian settlement from the 15th century. So the strategies they were drawing upon there also had roots in that experience. So when we think about transnationalism, right, it's just the complexities keep growing. So in this community where these women were from, just to give you a sense of what this movement looked like, 36 women were arrested after they occupied and then destroyed the municipal offices, throwing the furniture into the streets. Right? So this was direct action. This is their political strategy. Soon after the uprising, close to 1,000 women formed a group called the Fascio di Lavoratrici, which was a union of workers. They celebrated the founding of the group as they would a religious festival, with music and food, and they wove their political and spiritual ideologies together in their speeches. In the words of one woman, she said, "We want everybody to work as we work. There should no longer be either rich or poor. All should have bread for themselves and their children. We should all be equal." Jesus was a true socialist, and he wanted precisely what we ask for, but the priests don't discuss this. So I found this was really interesting to me, to think about the ways Italian women were critical of the state and the church simultaneously, as well as, and then that would extend into the men in their communities, you'll see shortly. So that this was a political discourse that was emerging at this time that was really independent of any political party or any social movement, but that was very much rooted in their lived experiences of suffering. So the reaction to this movement was really quite severe. The Italian government responded swiftly. The prime minister called for a state of siege and sent 40,000 military troops just to Sicily alone, because these uprisings were happening all throughout Sicily. I gave you one example, but they're all throughout the villages in Sicily, Calabria, Puglia, Campania, all the main regions all throughout the south. So 40,000 troops just to Sicily. Movement leaders and participants were arrested, beaten, gunned down in the streets, or executed in prison. And by 1900, most of Italy's peasantry and workers had experienced or heard of this kind of revolutionary struggle. So many of the activists that I was studying who became union organizers or anarchists or socialists in the 19-teens and 20s, their parents had engaged in this kind of struggle or really grew up in this period of resistance. So it was in this climate that mass migration took place. As Italians arrived in New York City by the tens of thousands, the city was also fast becoming one of the more important and larger centers of diasporic radicalism in the world. This is not only for Italians, but for immigrant workers from Poland, Lithuania, Hungary, Russia, China, Spain, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and other islands in the Caribbean. Most of these immigrant workers were excluded from mainstream labor unions and political institutions. So as a result, they turned to the Mutual Aid Society. This was really at the heart of all of these groups. Their political culture and their political strategies was to come together to form a group that was called a Mutual Aid Society. And this is common for working class African Americans throughout this period as well, right? The Benevolent Association. These groups were the only formal organizations that successfully mobilized the masses of immigrant and migrant workers before the First World War, including Italians. They were crafted by workers and peasants in their homelands for the most part, and then reconstituted abroad through migration and resettlement to meet the most immediate material needs. They provided things like health insurance, death benefits, loans, medical services, but they also provided a cooperative social setting for people to come together. They were relatively autonomous cultural and political spaces, so they became centers for education, for activism, for community building, and recreation. This is a photograph of a picnic. These groups also would come together. You would have groups that really formed around workplaces. So just to give you an example, in the handmade cigar industry, socialist and anarchist mutual aid societies with names like La Aurora and El Ejemplo brought together Cuban, Puerto Rican, and Italian cigar makers in Harlem during the 19-teens and 20s. Their monthly lectures, dances, and picnics often extended to include workers in other trades from Russia, Hungary, and Poland. And they would have these events where they would, folks would speak in multiple languages and perform theater in multiple languages and choral groups. And May Day was, of course, the most important holiday of the year. So that was when all these groups would come together and meet in various parks for a big picnic. And I use this picture a lot because I feel like it captures, there's two reasons. One is because to counter it to the Hine and Riis photos is really quite dramatic, right? To think about the different stories that these images tell about these subjects and about their lives. But also because I think this explains why people were drawn to these movements, that it was a place to relax, to meet folks who were like-minded, to have fun, right? To have a good time, to get dressed up, right? These are folks who were working in menial conditions, who never had that opportunity to, rarely had that opportunity, working 7 days a week. So to be able to, get dressed up, I love how they're all wearing, super stylish clothes, and right, that these are, for the most part, textile workers and garment workers, right? That desire to wear nice fabric and to wear beautiful clothes was, as we know from those of us who work in working class history, is such an important way that working class people across race and ethnicity, right? The ways that working class people overall express their humanity. So in Patterson, too, just to give you another example of a different kind of group, and the possibilities for what these groups were able to do. The Patterson, New Jersey group had a bookstore, a theater troupe, and a chorus. They also organized what they called a Università Popolare. They organized they called it a university, which sponsored public lectures, social gatherings, and study groups. So these groups, these mutual aid societies, were called by Italians, they were called circoli, and they often drew thousands to their events. My friend Sal Salerno, who writes about this history as well, has written how this milieu comprised an extensive web of associations that mixed cultures, languages, and ideologies. This network provided a foundation to the revolutionary transnational multi-ethnic working class culture in this period. So I encountered women in this world really through this one newspaper, La Questione Sociale. This newspaper, Italian radicals published many different newspapers over the early 20th century. And many of them were edited by men. They were filled with the writings by men. You saw very little traces of women in any of these papers. But in this newspaper, this was a one exception. This is a newspaper that was published in Patterson and in New York City too at various times between 1895 and 1915 by this group called the Gruppo Diritto all'Esistenza, which is the Right to Exist group. And this was an anarchist group that numbered, and actually was one of the largest groups in the Northeast. Folks estimate that there were thousands of people in this group. probably close to a couple of dozen people who were active members who met weekly and who were considered really the core group, but their influence was really quite extensive. This newspaper that they produced is widely recognized by historians as one of the most significant newspapers of the anarchist movement in this period worldwide. And it's just a fascinating document. And I think this too speaks to what it means to do transnational histories, right, to work in multiple languages, because this is what I've discovered early on, is how invisible these histories were to folks writing US immigration history, because they weren't looking at sources in Italian, right? So this newspaper was originally published in Florence and then in Buenos Aires by Enrico Malatesta, who was one of the most influential anarchist thinkers and activists of this period. He would come to Patterson, New Jersey and really inspire the movement there. And so this newspaper was brought there. But this was very much a newspaper with global significance, but also attention, and would write about labor struggles all over the world. And since migrants were everywhere, they would report back on what was happening in these different communities. And so the articles were always from workers in different locations reporting about what was happening in various parts of the world. So there's a level of cosmopolitanism that I think is really quite significant, to think of working class folks who are semi-literate, engaged in really cosmopolitan politics, right, where they're aware of what's happening around the globe, I think was very much a part of this moment. This newspaper too would have, not only did it have places where people would report, but it would also connect with other newspapers. You know, the editor of this newspaper, Pedro Esteve, also edited the main Spanish language newspaper of the time, El Despertar, in New York City, and was tied to Spanish, Puerto Rican, Cuban, and other Spanish-speaking anarchists throughout New York. And so he, as a figure, but also the communities in which he represented, that these presses became a way for these groups to kind of become aware of one another and share information. So, for example, when this newspaper became La Nueva by the 19-teens, the Mexican Revolution was front-page news for at least a year. And you had the Italians who were evading the draft for World War I going into Mexico, reporting back on the revolution. And then you had the newspaper for the Mexican Revolution, La Generación, was reporting on what was happening in the north through the Italian anarchists. So the press, the radical press, was one of the most important mediums through which radicals globally kind of shared information, I guess is the most important part. When I found this edition, you might notice, for those of you who speak Italian, that it says here, I gruppi femminili di propaganda, which was women's propaganda groups. I discovered that women began meeting on their own, in their own groups, as early as 1897. And they called them women's propaganda groups, but they also named each group, kind of like the Right to Exist group. And so the women in Patterson in New York City called theirs the Gruppo Emancipazione della Donna, the Women's Emancipation Group. So it first formed in New York City, then across the Hudson River in Patterson, Hoboken, and then women's groups formed in Philadelphia, Boston, New Haven, Chicago, and the mining communities in Illinois, Pennsylvania, and Vermont. And they used the press to kind of share what they were doing, the kinds of events they were holding, to encourage others to form similar kinds of groups. And they also connected through the press and through their migratory networks, of course, to anarchist feminist groups in Buenos Aires, Paris, Milan, Rome, and beyond. So these are women who are garment workers and textile workers, part of this international movement, right? That they're connecting to other women workers through the press and through this whole social milieu. Together, their goal was to create a place for women from the working classes to come together and to develop their own visions for emancipation. Some use the word feminismo to describe their work, but most preferred emancipazione because it distinguished their activism from bourgeois feminisms and captured the all-encompassing nature of the freedoms that they desired. La Questione Sociale contains the names of hundreds, even thousands of Italian immigrant women active in the anarchist movement as writers, performers, organizers, subscribers. Some women owned, there was a woman I found, Elvira Catello, who owned press. She pulled money together and founded a press in Harlem and began printing pamphlets and other kinds of literature in Harlem. And her library and bookstore became one of the more significant in the area. So this paper was particularly significant to me to uncover this history. And I just thought I would show you this photograph to give you a sense of the kinds of physical spaces that these folks also created. This was the newspaper's headquarters. You might notice the IWW logo on the top, the Industrial Workers of the World. The Patterson Anarchists the Italian anarchists were one of the first groups to join the IWW and to bring it to the Northeast. And they were at the founding meeting in Chicago and were very much a part of the industrial workers movement. So that when we think about this, right, that we think of the Mutual Aid Society really emerging into a political group that then connects to other groups regionally, right, through picnics, through performances, through lectures, but then it connects with, and internationally through the press, but is also part of this much larger social movement unfolding in the US, the industrial workers of the world at this time. And this is a photo of the Patterson Anarchists, and I love showing this to students because they're always shocked that these are the anarchists, right? But these are the anarchists. So this is actually 3 families. One of the things I discovered was how much the anarchist movement was really family-centered. Folks came into the movement through a brother or sister who brought them to a meeting, sometimes with their parents' approval, sometimes without it. And there was intermarriage, of course, because people wanted to be with, of course, anarchists didn't formally marry with the state, but they wanted to spend their lives with folks who were held similar ideals and values. And so the movement was very much rooted in familial kind of settings and those kinds of bonds that were created through friendship and sociality. The folks that you see right here, Ninfa Baronio is one of the women who formed the women's group in Patterson. I'll talk about her in a minute. And her partner, Firmino Gallo, the two of them owned the largest, what many think of as maybe the largest anarchist bookstore in North America at the time, in Patterson, and it was constantly being raided by police, unrelentingly, really, from the early 1900s, even before the Red Scare of the First World War, right? Their shop had been raided 4 or 5 times. But they worked together, right, to kind of to not only circulate materials but also to produce them. And the women's groups made use of that, right? They had a press, so they could publish pamphlets and get women's writing out and circulate it through the shop. Oh, I forgot to press my timer. Is it 4:40? Is that where I am? Yeah. Okay. So I think what I'll do is just very quickly talk you through a little bit of this so I can get to the part. I want to introduce you to a little bit of the racialization. This is one of the women that I write about, Maria Rhoda, with her family. Maria Rhoda and Pedro Esteve, I would discover their companionship was actually what enabled women's writing to make it into the press, because he was editing La Cuestione Sociale during the years when women's writing became so prolific in the press. And she was one of the key organizers of the women's group. So there's a period of about maybe 15 years where women's writing came to the surface in this newspaper, and I have to believe that it was due to their collaboration. And part of what I think is really interesting about this movement was the way in which men and women were reimagining companionship and relationship and creating spaces to support one another's politics. I just recently actually contacted, one of the things that's been interesting about my book being out is the families of these folks have now come forward to find me. I had a hard time finding them because Esteve is a common name, right? So, and Pedro Esteve, I should note, was a Spanish anarchist from Barcelona, and he and Maria Rhoda had met in Italy in an anarchist gathering and then reunited in Patterson in 1893. And became, took up and became really involved in organizing workers, textile workers, garment workers, cigar workers. They lived in New Jersey for a while in Patterson, but then they moved down to Tampa and organized workers in Tampa, and then came back and settled in Weehawken. And their home was this center of political activity in this period. Sundays was not only a time for an amazing meal at their house, but it was a place where meetings were held and people would come and stay for the weekend as they were coming through, different organizers. And so one of the things that's happened is I just recently met all of their grandchildren, and none of them knew about their activism in the anarchist movement. And so this is actually quite common, I've found, is that the grandchildren and the great-grandchildren have no idea, and it's really as a result of the Red Scare and what it has meant to become an American and what kinds of histories have to be repressed and identities have to be repressed in order to become a white American especially. And so I just want to share with you, Ernesta Cravello is another one of the women. She, with Maria Roda and Ninfa Baronia, was active in the women's group, and she was somebody who really became targeted by the press in 1901 when Gaetano Bresci, who was active in the Patterson Anarchist movement, went and assassinated the king of Italy. You can imagine that authorities began to focus on the Patterson scene. And they really focused on this one woman, Ernesta Cravello, and reporters tracked her down in Patterson outside the mill, and I want to give you her, I want you to hear what she said, because I think she describes what anarchism meant to this generation so clearly. Reporters quoted her as saying that she did not know of Bresci's intention to kill the king when he returned to Italy, but that she was happy that someone had done so. News of her response traveled across the United States and the Atlantic. Outraged at being misquoted, and with her depiction of the mainstream English language newspapers as fanatical, she wrote to the popular Italian language daily Il Bollettino della Sera to clarify her position. She said, "They are only right in the fact that I am an anarchist. This is because I am moved by the suffering of hundreds of millions of workers, and I struggle for a world in which such exploitation is no longer possible." And I think this encapsulates what so many of these women were articulating. Anarchists debated endlessly what anarchism meant, but they agreed generally, they united generally in their desire to eradicate all forms of domination, authority, and exploitation, and in the belief that both private property and the government were harmful because they required that people live under a system of inequality and surrender their own power. And this was really the heart of I think, the seed that they planted, because a central component of the radical culture that women created was to argue that revolution was not something you waited for, it was something you lived. It was something you did in every moment of every day. And I think this really connects back to the panel right beforehand about what spaces are possible for radical change, right? They believed every space was a space for radical change. No space existed outside of that, and that they appreciated the subtle. And their essays, the women's essays, all throughout the La Questione Sociale were really about this. Were about raising children in a different way, about just building community in different ways, about marriage, imagining marriage and free love. They called it free love, amore libero, but it was complicated. It wasn't just have as many partners as you want. It was, what does it actually mean to enter into a relationship and give freely of your love, right? So that they were thinking about revolution and social change on very deep levels, but on very subtle, everyday, nuanced levels too. The other thing that I was really struck by was how much they were writing about power within their own community. They certainly were pointing the finger at the bosses and at the state. Right? They were very critical of their working conditions and the government, increasing the kind of repressive role of the government. But they were also arguing, as one woman said in 1906 in the newspaper, we should take a glance not only at the bourgeois society, but at ourselves, workers who are part of the anarchist family. And so as a result, many of them spoke about abuse in families. They wrote about rape. They wrote about domestic violence. They wrote about their own responsibility to watch over what they had internalized in the world in which they lived. As one woman said, a deep struggle, she said, is every day to pull out the false roots that have been nourished in my heart, right? This notion that everybody internalizes this system and that it's everybody's responsibility to do that work, to extricate that. And they also denounced racism. They wrote endlessly, really, about lynchings in the U.S. and about U.S. imperialism. And they came under attack during the major Red Scare of World War I, because of this writing in particular. When we looked at, a group of us looked at the FBI files to wonder why they targeted the Patterson Anarchists, and not just because of the assassinations that had happened. But the FBI was most, or that Bureau of Investigation at the time, was most concerned with the ways in which these newspapers were speaking out against white supremacy and building alliances with people of color around anti-racism. That was what was seen as particularly egregious. Now, many people will also say to me, like, well, these ideologies were so kind of compelling, but there was such a small part of the Italian immigrant community. And that certainly is the case. Italian anarchists were absolutely in the minority. But there were moments where their ideologies moved out into mass settings, and strikes were really an occasion for that. Patterson had a massive strike in 1913 in which 25,000 people were on strike for over a year. It was a very difficult strike. They thought, building on the success of Lawrence in 1912, the textile strike in Lawrence, that they would be able to launch a similar strike, but they were mistaken. The manufacturers used a tactic that they would use for much of the 20th century. They moved production elsewhere, right? And to find folks who were less organized and less capable of resisting. This is a meeting, a strike meeting. In Patterson, strikers were not allowed to gather in Patterson, and so an Italian family in the neighboring town of Halden held strike meetings at their home because they had this front porch, you might be able to see, where speakers could speak from the second floor. And so these were moments, the Patterson anarchist community was at the heart of this strike. They were the organizers, they were the folks, they were the speakers, and so these are moments when we see, folks who their first engagement with politics was a strike like this, that they were internalizing, really coming to learn and know about the radical subculture through these massive strikes that really took place. I mean, the strike wave for Italians certainly was from really the 19-teens all the way through the 1930s and 40s. And then, of course, you have the influence by the IWW. Women are a big part of, I'm just going to move through these quickly, a big part of the strike movement. Here's a Women at a May Day parade that drew over 40,000 participants, and this is at a time when close to 120,000 garment workers were on strike. And so this first generation of labor organizers that begin to mobilize for, like, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, for example, many of them were drawn from the anarchist subculture and from the mutual aid societies. And then they would, of course, go on to deeply influence the anti-fascist movement as Mussolini comes to power in 1922. So Italians are thinking about the rise of fascism early on and connecting it to what's happening in the US in terms of the rise of the Ku Klux Klan and thinking about those connections of fascism kind of globally. Now, I want to just conclude by reflecting on why this history is one that has been lost. A large part of the reason I discovered was that, first of all, was that Italian immigrant women weren't developing alliances with middle-class white feminism, right? So it meant that their activism was really kind of largely unseen. With only a few exceptions, Italian women often appear, right, as kind of non-actors, as passive bystanders or ignorant strike breakers in most narratives of labor history or even women's history from this period. And part of that is the problem with the waves, right? This thinking of women's activism as only happening in two waves, right? That is so centered on white middle-class women's history. But I would discover that these ideas of docility were kind of not just in the imaginary of historians, but that they were the product of the nation-building and race-making projects in both Italy and the US at the turn of the century, in both countries, to reinforce popular assumptions about the backwardness of southern Italy. And it points, I think, to why transnational history is so important, because it helps us to kind of undermine these national narratives. So beginning in the mid-19th century, northern Italian elites justified their domination and exploitation of southern Italy by racializing the peasant women they found there as beasts of burden, as exotic women in need of civilization, and as sexual and political deviants. So they kind of adapted the virgin whore framework, right, that was so dominant this period. And so we see this trope happening in Italy of women as kind of capable of, Southern Italian women as capable of enormous amounts of physical labor, as beasts of burden, right? These are the images that are circulating at the time. And also, the kind of virginal image too. This is a photograph by Wilhelm von Bloden, a German aristocrat. And there's a great deal of travel writing of Northern Europeans going into Southern Italy at this time and writing about their experiences. And so they would take photographs and they would sell as postcards, so much a part of kind of the cultures of empire of this period. And would do ethnographic portraits of young Sicilian natives, as they said, really helping to popularize notions of Southern Italy as overly sensual and exotic. And at the other end of this spectrum were, of course, women who were seen as deviant. And this was the anxiety, is that as men migrated in large numbers, that women were left to their own devices and without the control of men and their families would turn insane or become just would become out of control. And one of the most influential criminologists of this period worldwide is a man named Cesare Lombroso. And these are images from his book. And these ideas were were really circulating throughout the U.S. at this time. Cesare Lombroso and his disciples were lecturing all throughout the U.S. They were speaking at Harvard and Yale and at various various communities. And arguing that criminality was something that was innate, right? That it was a racial characteristic. So I noticed that this paradigm or this understanding of Italians as racially inferior and yet and racially inferior along these lines, as capable of kind of innate criminality, whether it was in the form of the mafia, right, or anarchism, or as beasts of burden who were capable of enormous qualities of work, so that's why they went into such hard, took on such intense labor, right? It was because of their kind of innate ability to do such kind of work, right? You can see why these narratives would kind of serve to justify their repression on multiple levels. And then, of course, this notion, is this coming up? This isn't going to come up. I'll let it load. It's probably taking a minute to load. So that these ideas, and what was so striking to me was how much these ideas influenced race thinking in the U.S. Is that when Italians were encountered in the U.S. by Americans, that they were perceiving them within a kind of a racial typology that was already traveling across the Atlantic Ocean. The complexity, though, was that they had to kind of erase the African origins in Sicily and Southern Italy in order to kind of fully imagine them as European. And so that what you see is this, because in Italy, so much of the discourse on Southern Italy is about it being tied to Africa and is really rooted and connected to Africa. But the U.S. racial order doesn't really allow for that. This kind of black-white racial binary in the U.S., you have to be on one side or the other. And because Italians were so clearly European, that there's that the rhetoric of the day was about situating them as racially inferior Europeans. And so part of what I'm interested in is how they begin to negotiate that, right? Both coming to consciousness about what it means to be white, having had all these different racial experiences as they migrate, and then of course how that influences their politics. Because one of the things, one of my favorite quotes by James Baldwin is how, right, to become American, that there's the price of the ticket, right, is to become white and to repudiate kind of radical politics that are anti-nationalist, that are anti-imperialist, that are anti-racist. And for Italians, that's really part of their journey. And so we see the anarchist, socialist impulses really begin to disappear by the 1950s and 60s as Italians begin to assert themselves as Americans and begin to take on an American identity more fully. So I think I'll leave it there, and I'd love to hear your comments and thoughts. I know it was a lot of material to share with you. But yeah, thank you. Thank you for listening. and it's a shame this isn't loading, but it's this wonderful graphic from Judge magazine about that expresses the kind of racial anxieties of this period, and it shows Italians coming out of these big ships as little rodents with mafia and assassin kind of written on their heads, and so it kind of helps to explain this interesting location that they occupied as both racially other, but as white at the same time. And I'm happy to explain that further. I know that there's so much more I could say about that. Yeah?
Going back to what you said about this movement sort of dying out by the 50s and 60s, do you think you see perhaps still a continuation of American stereotypes of some Italians being sensual and exotic, with, say, Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin, crooning all about love and monopoly, etc.? Do you think that's still a continuation of that stereotype there?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that, what's interesting is because Italians have been accepted as whites and have asserted identities as whites, that the consequences of those stereotypes, I think are, while they persist, right, that they don't have real material consequences. They don't shape whether somebody can get a job or somebody can go to school, and so I think that's that they hang on and certainly shape, I think, people's lived experiences in various ways, and might still today, to some degree, shape the ways people are perceived and seen. But in terms of shaping structural inequality, right, that no longer persists in the way that it did, I think, at the beginning of the 20th century. Yeah?
I have two questions, but I'll ask the one that's most... Thank you. I don't think I need that. But, okay. I really appreciate your talk. And I thought that it really is your emphasis on women brings to light a lot of things that are suppressed in, say, historians who work on similar themes. Anton Bloch, who's an anthropologist, Eric Hobsbawm, Michel Foucault, Luisa Passerini in Italy. So I think that this is something in the work you're working on you should bring forward more. But the other thing I would like to, a question I would ask is, this period between 1870 and 1914 saw a rapid, perhaps the most rapid movement of labor and capital of any other period except our own. And in the course of that, people were prized out of agrarian situations in their millions, including many Southern Italians. So, do you think of anarchism therefore as a kind of conveyor belt between the sort of peasant, village peasant ethic of subsistence and a more urban-based kind of socialism?
Yeah, without a doubt. I think anarchism, was meaningful to Southern Italians before they ever became industrial workers, right? It really helped them to understand power relationships. And anarchism was really about reimagining the world without systems of authority and hierarchy. And so that was at the heart of it. So that's why Southern Italians were so drawn to it, even as farmers, right? That they didn't need the factory to teach them about those power relationships. They were experiencing them as workers, as exactly as you said, as they were being really divested of the land, right? Because the presence of the state means that there's more land that's owned privately or owned by the state or owned by the church, less available to people. That's why people are having a hard time farming at a subsistence level. It's why they're having a hard time, and one of the reasons that one of the tactics of this period of the resistance is land occupation. It's just inhabiting land and just farming it. Right?
That's something that Hobsbawm's written about, but he doesn't include women.
Yeah, exactly. And so when Italians begin to migrate to all these different settings, right, whether it's a mining community or a rural farming setting or an industrial factory, that anarchism it just grows even more so out of that experience. And so many of the oral histories, when people were asked, by various interviewers who interviewed this generation of anarchists. Think of Paul Average's book, right? He did these wonderful interviews. If this is something you're interested in, I recommend his Anarchist Voices and Anarchist Portraits. he did interviews with hundreds of anarchists from this generation, not just Italians, but from all over the globe. And so much of what they say is about their politicization is in rural and in urban contexts. But certainly the urban industrial experience, right, was so alienating and on so many deep levels that's also is what fed this movement tremendously. So I would agree absolutely with that. Yeah.
I'm wondering to what extent the class stratification processes of Italians were different along gender lines than might have been seen in other groups.
You know what's interesting about how class shaped this generation was that men were doing primarily seasonal work in construction and farming, and the women were the ones who were primarily more in larger numbers going into manufacturing and into factories and into factory work. And so that kind of created a certain class structure, I think, within families. That what I discovered was that it was women's wages that families subsisted on more than men's, because men's were so periodic and so kind of hard to depend upon, that it was the women in the family. And of course, this is at a time when everybody in the family was working, right, from time of 8, 9 years old on. And so that too, I think, provided, kind of a class dynamic in a family, that it's women who are going into factories and who are encountering the labor movement, the U.S. labor movement, right, the North American labor movement in that way, in a very different way than men are encountering it in the mines or in the fields. So I think that's where you see class stratification happen, is the kinds of working class labor that they're doing, rather than in kind of a middle class, working class divide. It's really within kind of working class communities, like various divides between. And then there's divides between artisanal work too, like cities like New York City and Chicago drew more folks who had more skills and who had a little more status, right? Folks who could, who were tailors or boot makers or shoemakers, had more status in southern Italian communities than a farmer. And so Italians really thought that they were moving up the class hierarchy by migrating, because they were leaving farming, the difficulty of farming work behind for the most part, and moving into what they saw as skilled artisanal labor, right, as tailors or as weavers. Only to find that work was so degraded and so poorly paid, and the conditions were so terrible. So I think there is this class consciousness that's shifting for them. That class in Italy is so very different from classes they're experiencing here. I hope that somewhat answers your question. I mean, the way that affects the political culture, just quickly, is that women are in the anarchist movement. There are more women in the part of the anarchist movement that is organizationalist, that are interested in industrial unionism, because they're in the factories where that's happening. And so that they're really driving the kind of union movement of this period. They're the ones that are absolutely critical to Italians becoming a part of the industrial union movement in North America. Julia.
Thank you for your talk. I enjoyed it tremendously. I was, in some ways, a follow-up to Kim's question. I was really interested when you kind of, even this notion of the women's movement as going through these waves, that this kind of this nationalist movement, right, that it really gets challenged by this transnational framework that you employ, that you pose. I was really interested in this, how these women are read. I mean, they're read as subversive by the state in so many different ways. And I guess I was more curious about what, within the movement, how these women are read. So, I mean, if we think about, that one newspaper seems to have been, as you noted, right, the one where women's voices could be recovered. But why were there sort of resounding silences in some of the other newspapers? And, what women in this movement in the United States are often read as, if they're political, as almost mannish. And what does that look like for these subversive women?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, because so much of their activism is, like most working class women and other marginalized women, is really tied up in solidarity with the men in their communities, right? So they absolutely had to fight for voice and space and authority within these movements, and that's a big part of what I talk about in my book, is how they do that. And so many of the essays they wrote in La Cuestión Social were about that, were about what it felt like to go to a meeting and to stand up and speak and have people ridicule you or not listen to you and to be disregarded. And they called out the men in the movement endlessly, you know, like, you say you're an anarchist, but meanwhile you go home and this is how you are with the women in your family, with your children, you know. And so how do we build a movement, you know, with that inconsistency and that with those problems, right? So they were very interested in thinking through that, of what that meant to really build a movement without systems of authority and hierarchy and began there, right, with relationships between men and women. And they met with some men wrote prolifically in the press to support them and say, yes, we need to build the anarchist world first within the family, and then it'll grow in the rest of the world. But they met resistance constantly, and you know, I heard it a lot in the oral histories. You know, there would be a certain man who, if you looked at the literature, was like, you know, in the historiography, is held up as one of the most important anarchists, right? Somebody like Carlo Tresca or Paolo Corbello, right? These men who were strike leaders, who were charismatic figures, you know. And then you talk to the women in their families, and they're like, this guy was a pain in the ass, you know. He was difficult. He was, you know, he never listened to the women, and he never treated us with respect. Or some of the descendants would say he was lazy, he never got off his ass, you know, that it was the women who were doing all the work, right? So I was really interested in these complexities, and my work is actually now going into this even more so, and to think about intimacy and love in these relationships, and just the ways the folks negotiated these tensions, right, in marriage and in child raising, because it's such a part of this culture, right? They were very self-aware about this, that if they couldn't get it right here, then how were they ever going to build the world they wanted to build? And then I think the presses that are filled with all the writings of men was so typical of Italian kind of masculinity, right? The sense of maleness that was very much of, you know, the provider, the caretaker, men were so deprived of that masculinity, I think, and as workers, and the constant humiliations that they endured, that they would seek out ways to recuperate that. And one way, of course, was to, you know, take over a press or take over a meeting room. And so it was interesting to me to see how women were calling them out without undermining them at the same time, right? Because they were as invested in their ability to grow and become more fully human. You know, that's what the anarchists talk about all the time. They're interested in their own individuality and their own humanness, rather than as being cogs in a machine or seeing each other, in humanizing one another. So I think that's part of what really struck me about this, was they're not just writing them off, right? But they have hopes for reimagined masculinity, I guess. Sure. Yeah, Dan.
Yeah, great talk. And I'm wondering if you could go back to the theme of looking at looking at the transnational lens and historically for today's world in crisis,
Yeah.
and why you think that's important, and maybe, you know, to go back to our earlier panel, how you deal with that in the classroom.
Well, gosh, I think the classroom is just an incredibly magical space. I mean, I heard somebody once say it's this room that exists, and you all walk into it and you have this experience and you leave it, and yet something happens there that I believe in. I believe in deeply, and I think that the anarchists that I've studied believed in that too, right? They met, they sat with one another, they talked about these things, they debated, they read, they studied, they became intellectuals. They invested, you know, their time and energy in that because they believed in a certain amount of community. That community building was absolutely critical, right, to social change and to humanizing, right, one another is. You know, the complexity and nuance of our own experiences, right, can happen in those conversations over a long time, where you really come to understand one another, and hopefully there's enough of a, maybe not trust, but a place where you can begin to express things that are more deeply held within that you might not reveal at first moment to someone. So I think, I don't know, my classroom, I think my intention is always is to move into a classroom I don't know, I always walk in with the kind of intention of that whatever unfolds serves the highest good, right? And it can be messy, and it can be difficult, and it can be, as I love what Leo said, they're going to be pissed at me, they might not like it, but that's okay, right? That there's, to hold that intention of the highest good, like whatever we do here, how can it serve the highest good, and to keep holding that, whatever that is, right? Like, I don't even know what that is, right? How could we know? But that's the intention of teaching and the intention of the classroom conversation. And I mean, so much of what was said earlier really spoke to me about what does it mean to create a space for people to just engage with one another and with ideas, right? And so that you kind of encourage that, right? And that's what I was also inspired by the anarchists, that they talked about how to, for example, like they didn't disparage religion, which was really interesting. Even though they were critical of the Catholic Church, they understood that many Italians had spiritual practices and beliefs that they were not going to easily let go of. So they would say, don't just ask your daughter to mechanically recite the Ave Maria, right? Talk to her about, what does this mean? What does it mean to you? What are the possibilities of this? To engage in that kind of critical discourse, to disentangle just the rote, kind of doing things just for the sake of doing them, right? But to inspire and awaken somebody, that kind of curious asker, right? The curious questioner. So much of what they do, and I think so much of what we hope to do in the classroom too. I don't know if that answers, so I know it's very vague, but it is kind of how I approach teaching. It's, just from that, in a way, of almost a spiritual kind of practice of just hoping that whatever unfolds is kind of feeds some common good, and trusting that every space has that possibility, right? Whether it's a meeting, among administrators, or whether it's, right, an advising moment with students, or whether it's, right, that each of these moments every moment has kind of this infinite potential, I guess. But I'd also like to ask you that question back, because to me, what are the radical possibilities of the transnational lens, right? Why has it become more and more significant in the last, I would say, right, 2 decades? I think it was, when I was thinking about this talk, I reread some of the early stuff that had been really significant to me, and I found that wonderful piece by Robin Kelly from the Journal of American History, where he talks about Black history's global vision, and notes how much ethnic studies has always been transnational, right? And out of necessity out of real critique of colonialism and imperialism and slavery, right? These sort of global systems, and how much ethnic studies has, I think, for so many of us, inspired the work we do. And that, at its heart, has always had a radical, right, impulse to call into question power, to dismantle power, to reimagine human relationships. And so I'd love to hear from anybody who wants to comment on that, having heard the papers today, just what you walk away like thinking about what becomes possible with this lens, why we're turning to this lens. Or maybe it's a question to take with. Yeah.
Well, I think, I've always taught, of course, I taught with an understanding. I mean, I work on places outside the United States, that it's important for Americans to understand that these are not just exotic places, that given the globalization of the division of labor, the tightening up of the imperial supply chain now, that their quality of life depends upon transnational realities. I mean, take a simple item, 2 simple items, platinum and coltan, right? Cell phones we have in our pockets, computers we use, all depend upon the production of 2 kinds of minerals. In South Africa, platinum is produced large. Most of the platinum used on the face of the earth is produced by a group of men who work for 6 hours, 6 days a week, 12 to 14 hours a day, 200 to 300 feet under the earth for less than $300 a month. That's why the Americana strike was so violent and why, and it is also so immediate to people in the United States and elsewhere who make use of these products. And we can extend this back to the end of the Second World War. I mean, some of us are old enough to remember these big fishtail cars that were produced in the 50s and 60s and push-button transmissions that were characteristic of the Chrysler products. No person, no American ever asked themselves, well, vanadium, there's not very much vanadium in the United States. How are they producing these things? Would people just simply enjoy the ride? Right? And that's pretty much what Gorbachev was referring to when he first came to the United States and said that after the Second World War, the people who run the United States created a new social contract based upon the notion that we'll give most of you the highest standard of living in the world, just as long as you don't ask us how we do it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's part of the reason why it's so difficult to teach people about these sort of transnational connections that the American Empire, or much like the British Empire, was predicated upon the sort of distribution and monopolization of various kinds of labor and raw materials from all over the world.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. And this, I think that's one of the reasons why the turn of the century is fascinating to me, because it is this moment where we see this shift taking place,
Yeah.
right? From the end of slavery, colonialism being kind of reimagined, and the birth of industrial capitalism and capitalist imperialism, right? And so what we see is, and so many of the social movements are the places that, the radical social movements that are pointing out those exact connections, right? That are saying, as the anarchists would say, why does the pleasure of some have to produce misery for so many?
So many.
Right? That was one of the beautiful lines I found by a woman, who's, as she said, I'm not an intellectual, I'm the daughter of a discredited and oppressed people, but that question of why does the pleasure of some have to produce misery for so many? And to ask that question, that's not something that we all need to invest in, right? We could reimagine a world where that's not the case. And for folks with the least amount of power, or among those who have very little power, to begin to ask that question, to believe they have the power to change that world is, I think, inspiring for us today, because we live in a moment, right, where to imagine a world without imperialism, without nationalism, without capitalism is extremely difficult, right? But they lived in a moment where these systems were still in flux and in formation, where they didn't take them for granted. Yeah, exactly. Joy?
Oh, no.
Oh. You sure, Joy?
All right. So we just want to thank Professor Guglielmo again for a great talk. And thank you all for a great discussion also. And let you know that we're going to be moving to a reception in the atrium now. So, yeah. Thank you.
Oh, yeah.